Hello, I'm Dylan, one of the Support and Engagement Executives for CTA, and I'm joined by Tim Kearns, Director for Policy and Nations, to talk about some of the things that you need to consider when deciding which exemption to choose when you're applying for a Section 19 permit in Scotland, Wales and England, and a 10B permit if you're in Northern Ireland. Tim, perhaps you could tell us a bit about what these exemptions are.
Thanks, Dylan. An operator providing passenger transport on a not-for-profit basis needs to apply for a permit. You need to do this so that you're exempt from the requirement to hold a public service vehicle operator's licence. More commonly, we call that an O licence. In order to be eligible for a permit, you must be able to demonstrate that you satisfy one of the three exemptions set out in the EU rules. For those who like to read the legislation, you can find the law if you Google EU Regulation 1071/2009. This regulation still applies even though we've left the EU. So here's a quiz question for you, Dylan. What are those three exemptions?
They are commonly known as 1, the main occupation exemption, 2, the exclusively non-commercial purposes exemption, and finally 3, the short distance exemption. But perhaps the more difficult question is, how do I know which one I need to choose?
That's a great question, Dylan. For organisations that are trying to figure this out, the first question you should ask is this: is passenger transport your main occupation? For most operators, this should be quite straightforward because it's about what your organisation spends the most of its time doing, what it spends most of its resources doing each and every day. Put simply and in short, it's about what you actually do and not necessarily what is set out in your legal documents.
So Tim, this would be organisations like schools, scout groups or community centres. In other words, you can rely on the main occupation exemption as long as providing transport is not what you spend the majority of your time doing. But what happens if this doesn't apply to my organisation?
Well, don't worry, there's two other exemptions if you don't fit the main occupation exemption. So let's look at the second one. It's known commonly as exclusively non-commercial purposes exemption. Now, this one isn't quite so straightforward. In 2019, the High Court in England was asked to determine exactly what this exemption means. The court determined that it is the purposes of your services, why you do the things that you do, should be the starting point for determining if this exemption applies to your organisation. Dylan, this seems quite complicated. How would you advise an organisation to ask questions about why they do the things they do?
You should have a conversation about why you run the services you do. This could be at a board meeting, a committee discussion, part of your annual accounts, or any other way that shows why you do the things you do. This discussion should be recorded in your minutes or your accounts.
You know, this is particularly important if you make a surplus or if you're operating contracts. If any service generates a surplus, you're allowed to do this, provided the purpose for operating that service was something other than generating a profit to cross-subsidise other activities. If a surplus is made on the services you operate, evidence must be held and retained that shows how that surplus was used. As Dylan has already said, this evidence could be things like accounts, board minutes, committee discussions. You should think about the ways that these discussions can be recorded in writing.
If your organisation is operating contracts, you should retain a record as to why each contract is being operated. There should be a clear and genuine organisational discussion about each and every contract you hold and enter into. The reasons should align with your organisation's purpose, and the reason you enter into the contract cannot simply be to generate a surplus to use elsewhere in your organisation.
If you do not have any contracts and rely solely on grants and fair income to operate your services, then you'll be able to use this exemption as well. But it's still a good idea to record the purposes for your services in a way that's permanently recorded as evidence. Every time you start a new service, your board or trustees should ensure that there is evidence that they have fully considered the guidance and are satisfied that all of your services are being operated exclusively for non-commercial purposes. If you're unsure, you should probably seek legal advice.
So, the primary purpose of my organisation is to provide passenger transport, which means I can't apply under the main occupation exemption, and my board are not satisfied that we're operating for exclusively non-commercial purposes, so we can't use that exemption either. What's our final option, Tim?
Well, the final option that we have, Dylan, is the short distance exemption. This allows you to operate your transport services within a radius of 10 miles measured from a specific central point, or in a 10-mile straight line between the first passenger getting on and the last passenger getting off the bus. Even though in relation to the guidance you're considered to have some commercial purposes, you're judged to only have a minor or a small impact on the transport market because of the short distances that you're travelling. If you operate in a rural or sparsely populated area, then you can apply for extenuating circumstances which allow the 10-mile limit to be increased, so long as the impact of your services on the transport market is still judged to be small.
This exemption really is the backup plan when you have determined that you don't fit within the other two. Okay, Tim, I've found the right exemption. Is there anything else that I need to think about?
One thing that is clear in the new guidance that was set out at the end of last year is that the same legal entity cannot hold both an O licence and a Section 10B, 19 or 22 permit, and this is regardless of which exemption you think you qualify for.
That's a lot of ground that we've covered, but remember, if you have any questions about permits or exemptions, you can check out all of our resources in the members area of our website or contact us on advice@ctauk.org.